So the pipeline is meant to be 1,443 kilometers long. It's a crude oil pipeline and infrastructure to transport Uganda's crude oil from Hoima in Uganda to Tanga in Tanzania. If constructed, this will be the longest heated crude oil pipeline in the world, producing an estimated 34 million tons of carbon emissions annually, according to environmental experts and campaigners. The project has already displaced thousands and threatens the water resources, livelihoods of millions of people in the Lake Victoria Basin, as well as wildlife. Now, there's an organization called 350africa.org that is an international movement of ordinary people working to end the age of fossil fuels and build a world of community-led renewable energy for all. The Stop EACOP, let's just call it. Stop the EACOP campaign is one that is pushing and championing against the construction of this particular one. The coordinator of this campaign, Omar Elmawi, joins us in the studio now. Good morning, Omar.
Good morning to you.
Good to have you in the Situation Room.
Thank you for inviting me here.
Welcome and occupy the hot seats with pride.
Definitely, I plan to.
This is Kenya's biggest conversation. Omar, you've just had me talking about this East African crude oil pipeline. We've known about it, we've heard about it, we've seen the deals that were being signed by the two presidents of Uganda and Tanzania. Total Energies is running the project. We know also there was a whole conversation about Kenya having a similar project that goes all the way into Uganda and transports crude oil through the port of either Mombasa or the port of Lamu at Lapset. But then there's opposition to this. But before we talk about that, let's understand the organization that you represent, 350africa.org.
Yeah, definitely. So today I'm representing 350 Africa, which is a Pan-African organization that's trying to push for making sure that we do not have any fossil fuel projects in Africa. And it also has a global chapter. And why we're trying to do that is not because we are against development. It's not that because we don't want our people to gain employment, but because when we looked at all different parameters on these so-called developments in courts, we realized that it's harming more our people, and it's only benefiting the financial institutions as well as the companies that are coming to Africa to extract these resources at the expense of Africa and Africans. So that's the gist of the organization. But I'm here also to represent the Stop East African Crude Oil Pipeline campaign or coalition, which is not just 350 Africa, but a consortium of more than around 260 organizations that have come together from all parts of the world to try and stop not just the East African crude oil pipeline, but any other fossil fuel project that's happening within the whole of Africa. So that's sort of in a nutshell about 350 and the campaign that I represent here today.
Okay. So stop the East Africa crude oil pipeline, and we've heard that a couple of times. And then when you have a campaign that starts with that stop, then you're giving the impression that something is wrong. Right?
Exactly.
So what exactly is going on here, and why have a campaign to stop something that for many folks have thought this is something great in terms of access for the region?
Yeah, and as you'll imagine, it's something that we are actually having a lot of public debate around because to many people it looks more aggressive and more of we're trying to stop sovereign countries from making decisions that they need to take. But our position and why we're saying no to it is, as you've already said, I mean, the picture that has been painted is that this is going to be an important project that's going to be making sure that we're taking or utilizing the resources that are found in East Africa, and that it's going to create job opportunities for people, unemployed people, and also it's going to create cheap oil and fuel for our countries to prosper. But because we've taken our time and we've looked at all the different facts that are available, we've realized that one, the East African crude oil pipeline is a project that Total Energy, which is not an African company, owns more than 60% of. And together with another company, they own about 70% of the pipeline. And therefore, our East African colleagues, Uganda and Tanzania, only have to share about 15% each from the proceeds of the pipeline. And what this means is that therefore, all about 60% of the profits will be going to abroad, to other countries, while we are taking all of the risks, we are taking all of the impacts, and we're also taking all of the pollution that is happening here. So that's why we're saying stop, because it's not in the best interest of East Africa for this project to proceed, because it does to us more harm than any good that's being tried to push.
So is your position bigger on the ownership structure of this project, or is it on the fact that this pipeline is transporting crude oil?
It's on every other dimension.
Which one is bigger?
As I mentioned. So
if it wasn't Total Energies,
yeah,
if it was a Ugandan and Tanzanian company, a consortium of companies domesticated in Uganda and Tanzania that were constructing this, would you be okay with it?
The thing is, as I said, it's not the only parameter that we're using, because, apart from saying that, despite all the impacts and that all the profits are going abroad, also there are better alternatives in this case. So we're not just saying stop, that we don't want development. We're saying there are better pathways for people to develop. And therefore, if we really wanted to improve East Africa and East Africans, then why not invest in renewable energies that are cheaper, if not competitive, to fossil fuels? And we don't have to be worried about all of these impacts that we're speaking about. So it won't really matter about who's doing it. But at this point, we are it's double jeopardy for us, because we are none of our companies here in Africa are benefiting from the project. But then secondly, we are also going to be suffering from the impacts of the same.
Why 350? Why not 450? Why not 650?
Or 360?
Or even 1,000? Why?
180.
Yeah, exactly. So I should have started by saying 350 is what they call the particulate, the amount of carbon that's available on the atmosphere.
Parts per million.
Yeah, parts per million.
Yes.
And when it was formed, that was what it was at that particular time.
Yes.
That was about 10 or so years ago. So it was around 350 parts per million. And therefore, we wanted to at least have a baseline of showing when we started, this is where we are. And as we keep progressing, this is the whatever things that we're benefiting or we're gaining as we're trying to.
So the 350 is what you call a safe margin.
Yes, exactly.
And right now, those who understand this science claim that we are at what, 400?
Yeah, it's about more than around that. Yeah,
which means we are at a point where we are actually in danger.
Yes, exactly.
Now, explain to us so that we may understand the danger that we speak of. What does it actually present in real terms? When we go beyond the 350 and we get to 400, what then presents it? What harm are we likely to see, or are we likely to witness?
Yeah, and it's a good question, because, let's put away the science and speak about how things are actually manifesting in Africa, for instance.
Yes.
So, for instance, in Africa, historically, we've contributed to about only 4% of the historical emissions, carbon emissions that we're speaking about, but we are actually one of the most affected continents. So if you speak about Cyclone Idai, if you come back home here in Kenya, talk about some of the locust invasions, talk about floods and other things that are happening as manifesting as natural disasters, are actually because of the exacerbating impacts of climate change, which Kenya has alluded that it's affecting us significantly. And it's one of the reasons why our president has, even in different platforms, committed to get Kenya towards 100% renewable energy country that's only depending on renewable energy, partly because of how climate change is affecting us. And therefore, for us, the more we are emitting more carbon on the environment, the more the climate change becomes a serious issue. And it's a big problem right now because, one, as I said, because Africans are saying that we have not contributed as much to climate emissions, we're now saying that we need to be given an opportunity to also take advantage of what the global north has done for us to be able to get to where they are right now. And while this might look as an incentive of something that makes a lot of sense, but we've also looked at different places where fossil fuels are happening in Africa, and we've actually seen that fossil fuels do not necessarily make countries richer. They actually contribute to impoverish countries. Just take an instance, a country like Nigeria. Nigeria is one of the biggest economies in Africa, but I think in 2018 or 2019, Nigeria overtook India by having the most people living under extreme poverty. And therefore, what this shows is that it's not necessarily about the revenue that's coming to the country, but it's also about the other different factors that are being affected. So is tourism being affected? Is agriculture being affected? And how many jobs do these industries bring into the economy? And therefore, do we factor all of these impacts before we start thinking about one single source of revenue that might be affecting all these different other factors? I think that's what they call the Dutch disease.
So even as we look at all those things, we are talking about Africa, where very many of the economies in Africa are actually underdeveloped, right? Or developing economies. But they bear the brunt of this climate change from the countries that are the bigger polluters. So today, as you're launching your campaign and saying let's not go into fossil fuel production, let's explore ways of going green energy production, you'll agree that still more of the energy production in Africa is green than fossil.
Not necessarily. There are countries that are really green in Africa in terms of the energy progression. There are countries that are really bad. But I agree with you that
on average.
But I agree with you that Africa, we have more than 600 million people that don't have access to energy, especially electricity.
Yep.
And it's one reason why majority of the African countries are speaking about gas, for instance, as a transition fuel for us to catch up with the rest of the world before we can now start speaking about renewable energy. But as I said, I mean, while we are acknowledging that we have energy shortfalls, we are saying that this is an opportunity for Africa to show that we can actually leapfrog fossil fuels and show leadership in terms of making sure that we implement and use renewable energy. For instance, here's a fact I'm going to throw out. Africa has the most potential for solar energy within the whole world. And less than 1% of solar capacity, global solar capacity, is in Africa. And that already tells you that we are not investing enough resources in renewable energy within Africa because, one, it's available in plentiful. Two, we are not worried about things like wars and global markets changing, that the fuel is going to be expensive. Once we have the wind, we have the solar, then this is a fuel that's available. We don't have to worry about escalating fuel prices. And then third, as technology keeps progressing, they're saying that within the next 2 years, right now, renewables, especially wind and solar, are competing with fossil fuels. Within the next 2 years, fossil fuels will be more expensive than renewable energy.
So why aren't African countries exploring solar, wind, and other renewables?
I can only speculate because I don't know who's advising them. But I think, one, they're looking at the short gains in terms of how the model has been set, is that we are looking at selling this energy. And the sad thing is that most of these fossil fuels, while we're saying they're for Africa, they're not actually for Africa. Most of them are taken into international market all over Africa. I mean, if you talk about oil in Nigeria, if you talk about oil in the East African crude oil pipeline, why they need the pipeline is that oil can be taken from Uganda to Tanzania into oil tankers and go into international markets.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily that we're solving the energy crisis in Africa, but we're actually, exploiting and sending these resources out there.
Back to my question. So why are African countries not exploiting solar, wind, and others to provide energy to African populations?
As I said, for different reasons. One, I would think maybe it's because, as I said, it's an easy sell in terms of selling these resources. Secondly, I would say maybe they are not really informed by sort of making decisions to benefit the public, but maybe just few individuals within government who are looking at making quick killings, kickbacks, and other different incentives that they might have. But then third, it's maybe someone have not informed them as much. And I think they have more clever people than I am. I have no background around energy, but I've looked at all the different parameters, and I know that fossil fuels don't necessarily help. Here's an example. Just here in Kenya, I mean, I'm sure you've heard about the Turkana oil explorations and the Aili oil project that we tried to push for the country. And there was even a tussle because these people, especially the companies that are investing in Africa, are the ones that are coming here. They're the ones who determine what agreements we sign. And some of these agreements that we've signed are really skewed to benefit them than benefiting us. And they were even in a tussle about how much money really had they put or injected into making sure that they get the oil out of the ground. And the government was saying this is more money than what they thought. But because we are not necessarily well prepared in dealing with these issues, before even the exploration phase, it means that at the end of it, we end up gaining the least, while all of these resources end up going to.
But why do we blame the oil companies? They are businesses.
Yep.
I mean, they don't pretend that the purpose of their wanting to do business with us is to benefit us. Some of them are companies with shareholders. They are responsible for their shareholders. What is it that I would argue we should consider focusing on? How best then can we find a position where we can actually get better deals for ourselves? Because blaming the oil companies is a zero-sum game. They are doing what they do. Why don't we take a position, or what has been done to ensure that we take a position that would benefit us? That is the first point I want to raise. The second one, when people talk of fossil fuels, it is just the negative aspects. Are there any positive aspects of fossil fuels? I mean, are there ways in which you can exploit fossil fuels safely without all the backlash that we keep hearing? Or is there nothing positive that can be derived from fossil fuels?
Really, really good questions. So if I will start with the first one around companies and why we are making them their adversaries or enemies at this particular point, is one, they're not the only enemies, and I agree with you. I mean, for them, their interest is to make as much profit as possible and minimizing their costs. That's their whatever they're trying to do. And their allegiance is not to governments or to people. It is to their shareholders who are their bosses. So this makes a lot of sense. But we also know that some of these companies are quite rich. Their reach is quite deep, and they're able to topple governments. They're able to create civil unrests. While there might not be direct connections, but it's shown that fossil fuels, for instance, Mozambique in this particular matter, they're having a lot of civil unrest issues, increased militarization, lack of democracy because of exploiting, LNG, liquefied nitrogen gas,
Yes.
in terms of from the economy. And therefore, while we're saying they're not the people who are the biggest problem, because one, we have people who we've elected into government who should ideally be our representatives and should be making deals in the best interest of the people. But they're not doing the same. And therefore, it's one of the reasons why we're not just targeting the companies, we're also targeting these governments, because we want to have them on the same table, make them really understand why these fossil fuel projects are not necessarily helping the governments. I mean, the deals that they're making, the risks that they're taking on the deals, the debt that they are getting into the economy to keep exploiting some of these resources is big, including the risks around these resources becoming inconsequential in the next few years is also important. And therefore, we're not saying that the companies are the only people to blame. The governments are also to blame. And it's really, really important that sooner rather than later, they understand who they're really representing. People within these countries and not just the oil corporations. But on the second question, around the positives, as I said, I mean, if there are any positives around fossil fuel development, it will be some of the job opportunities that are coming from the project. And then secondly, it will be about the revenues that we're getting from it. But looking specifically on some of the fossil fuel projects we've had in Africa, the jobs are very minimal, and most of them are coming from abroad. So it's not people within the country; it's expatriates from China and other parts of the country of the world that are coming to do these jobs. But then, secondly, it's also some of the jobs that are being affected. This oil pipeline that we're speaking about here today, the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, is a 1,400 plus kilometer pipeline that's going to be cutting across about 400 villages, 200 rivers, two of the most important lakes within Africa, Lake Albert and Lake Victoria. One of those lakes, Lake Victoria, supports up to 40 million people for fresh water and for food production. And more than a third of that pipeline is passing through the basin of Lake Victoria. And therefore, if any oil spills happen around this region, which is not far-fetched because we've seen many of them happening in Nigeria and other parts of the world, it means it's a total headache, not just for Uganda and Tanzania, but also for Kenya, which shares that resource. And therefore, for us, or if there are any benefits compared to the cost, if you do a cost-benefit analysis of fossil fuels, it makes more sense to look at the alternatives that we can explore rather than making sure that we're making companies richer and richer every year at the expense of the continent.
I still wanted to, just from what that question that Eric had asked earlier, so which countries, if any, are making moves to then implement some of these strategies that are essentially going to aid and assist the environment? Because if I find it hard to acknowledge that something so potentially detrimental to the environment across board then is not being embraced by many governments to say, look, then we ought to do something about this. Or if it is, then the benefits of not doing it far outweigh the demerits. So who's doing something about it? And then, what example can be followed?
Yeah, so many people are doing something about it. One of the examples will be the United Nations General Secretary, Antonio Guterres, has been very clear that fossil fuels, we should be making a plan towards transitioning to renewable energy, and that fossil fuels is not the way to go. And, as the United Nations Secretary General, it shows the importance of us to move away from fossil fuels. But even the International Energy Agency, which is sort of the Vatican of fossil fuels, so to speak, in the world, they've also released several reports, including in 2021, where they're saying that we need to stop new fossil fuel projects and escalate moving towards renewable energy because of the conundrum that we are in today. Why we are not there yet is that the truth is that this business makes a lot of money for especially the companies that are involved in doing this project. And therefore, normally you do not want to get into something new when you already know this other venture already promises you money. And it's one of the reasons why we're seeing most of these companies now looking at Africa as the next frontier, because for them, one, the regulations here are not as strong compared to the rest of the world, environmental laws. And then two, even if they're strong, they are able to change those laws within a day or two.
Yeah.
You've seen them passing laws in Uganda and Tanzania on the EACOP, where they're saying that, one, for instance, they won't be paying any corporate tax, which is about 30% of the profits of the project, for 10 years. They have a tax holiday period of 10 years of not paying any corporate tax, which is 30% of the profits. They have a tax period. They won't be paying the 15% required withholding tax. They'll only be paying 5%. They are also not going to be paying any taxes on imports that they're bringing into the country. So they are value-added tax exempt from bringing some of these issues. So for them, they know that they have parameters of making sure that the law is in a way that benefits them, and that they, all of these risks are taken by the country. So for them, it makes sense to come to Africa because it's friendly, so to speak, for their pockets, and they don't have to worry too much about repercussions coming from the same.
Let's take a break. Then we continue the conversation. It's 28 minutes to 10. We are having a conversation about the East African crude oil pipeline that's set to run from Uganda, taking crude oil into Tanzania and then offshore. Omar Elmawi is the coordinator of the Stop East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline campaign. He's from 350africa.org. He's giving us the lowdown of why exactly they're opposing to this project. We'll continue this conversation after this break.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Omar Elmawi is the coordinator of the Stop East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline campaign, and he's telling us why they're opposed to this. Omar, you've explained, okay, so the issues, commercial side, that the African countries are not benefiting from these deals, and then also from the pollution side. Let's take a step back, though, and look at what is it that we do with the fossil fuels. The fossil fuels are used to power economies, to provide energy that powers economies. And powering economy means that you're industrializing, that you're growing your economy into a state that can then benefit the people. If you look at the big polluters that we, so to speak, today, and then you look at the small polluters, so to speak, those are the African countries. Look at the mix of their energy. USA, 61% or thereabout of their energy mix is fossil fuel. Germany, Europe's largest economy. Close to 60% of their energy, again, fossil fuels. China in the last 20, 30 years has gone heavy on fossil fuels, has industrialized, has become the magic, right? Now, arguably the superpower in the world. African countries, the ones that you're saying do not need to do this. Uganda, for example, is not using that fossil fuel that is extracting from its ground to generate its own energy. It's using it to generate revenues. Then the revenues will be used to develop the economy. And then the economy would move. Where do we strike the balance between the need for us to industrialize, the need for us to also see how best and how fast we can power our economies to industrialize, and the conversation about the pollution? And I'll explain why I'm saying this. It's because when we hear the conversations from organizations such as yours, it's stop today. And you come to African countries that are just trying to do get by. There's a project by the Kenyan government to start a Lamu coal power plant that's just going to do 1,000 megawatts of power. And you say stop. There's a plan by any other country to get into coal or to get into fossil fuels, and they say stop. Yet, the big economies of the world, the conversation happens about stop, and they say, yeah, we're going to stop. What we're doing is we are scaling down on the fossil fuels. For example, Germany has shut down its nuclear, now gone into coal, and it's getting a lot of fossil fuels from Russia, but they are still using fossil. And they are going to use it for the next 20, 30 years. As they continue to develop, what happens to the African countries that need to develop?
Yeah, and it's really good questions. It's questions that everyone needs to ask themselves. And, what you haven't mentioned is while, the US 61%, Germany around 60%, and China still on fossil fuels, but the step back that they've been taking has actually been quite significant. So most of them have been cutting down on the fossil fuels. But I know people will be saying, when are we going to get into zero? But, looking at fossil fuels in Africa, and let's use some of the examples you've mentioned. So the Lamu coal plant case, which fortunately I was also the outgoing coordinator of the Decolonize campaign when we were fighting against it. So it's something that I know really clearly about. So one, if you look at Lamu coal plant, the coal itself was going to be initially imported from South Africa, and then they were planning to use coal in Kitui because we've discovered coal. But if you look at the agreements that have been signed on the project, it wasn't going to spur industrialization because it wasn't going to be cheaper than other sources of energy. For instance, the Turkana wind plant. Because the agreement that we signed, we were going to be paying about 37 billion shillings just to have that coal plant to be accessible. That's what they're calling it, capacity charges. Having it there to be able to generate electricity. And we are paying more the more they're generating it. And if fuel prices for coal keep going up, it means also the payments go up. And there's a think tank that looked at the agreements, and they've said that the tariff will cost anywhere between 20 to around 75 cents, which is about 75 Kenya shillings a kilowatt hour, which is more than 10 times what we are paying on geothermal currently that's available in Kenya. So the narrative that fossil fuels will help industrialization, will help to make the country better, is not necessarily true. And for instance, look at Mozambique, which I've also mentioned from before. The gas that's being made from there or being extracted from Mozambique, it's not for national consumption. It's mostly to be taken abroad into other markets for other people to utilize. And therefore, what this means is these people are not polluting the environment by extracting these resources, and they're benefiting by getting the fossil fuels coming to their end. And they're also saying that Mozambique, Nigeria are some of the countries that a lot of people don't have access to electricity and energy, despite the fossil fuel extractions that are happening.
Omar, you see, even as you're speaking, what I'm hearing you is conflating issues. Number one, you have an issue with how the contracts have been structured, valid. Then there's the issue of whether these fossil fuels are needed or whether they're important, whether they are good, whether they can, these countries actually need access to energy. I think when you start conflating those issues, when you say decolonize, you're basically saying don't bring coal. You're not saying let's review the contract, let's renegotiate the contract. Your main issue here sounds like do not bring coal. Yet, if that contract was negotiated in a different way, there would have been 1,000 megawatts of power available in the country. What's wrong with that? First of all, the technology that's going to be used is going to be a cleaner technology, the latest technology, even later than what they're using in Germany today to produce their power. Then we are talking about being able to eventually extract the coal that you have in Kitui and all. Economic development. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, as I said, I'm not really conflicting, but I'm trying to say if I was to argue the devil's side of the case, it still doesn't make any economic sense for us to do fossil fuels. And maybe the best way to put this will be one, we're not talking about hypothetical cases. We're talking about real projects that have been suggested for Kenya. And the Lamu coal plant becoming one of those cases, the technology that's going to be used is not state-of-the-art technology. Let's start saying there. It's going to be supercritical technology, which has been there for more than 50 years. So I don't know what's going to be new that they're going to be doing. And that's the definition of insanity right there, that we're going to be doing it differently rather than we've seen how bad it has been. And maybe the point that I want to make, because I see my colleague wants to come in with a question, the point that I really want to make is that these fossil fuel projects make sense when these people minimize the costs and maximize the profits. And therefore, the more you're putting technology, the more you're putting parameters to protect the environment, to protect the health, to protect the social aspects of the community, it becomes more and more expensive, and therefore no one will want to touch it. And therefore here, the argument will be, if you want us to say don't stop EACOP, then we say the people who are doing EACOP have to pay for all the impacts on environment, they have to pay on all the health impact that are going to be caused because of burning of the oil, they are going to pay all of the costs because of people losing their job opportunities in tourism, in agriculture and other factors. And once you say this, no one will want to touch the project because for them, they won't be making any money at the end of the deal because they have to pay for the real costs of actually having these projects on board.
Let me ask the question. When you talk about the conversation we're having right now, I want to ask the question, who owns it? Who controls this conversation? Is it activists such as yourselves? Or is it the sort of conversation that is had because it must be had, but yet it's been controlled by the very people who you seem to be pointing fingers at? If you look at any big industry on the planet, you would ask the simple question, yes, we have an abundance of sun, so this solar, as we refer to it, should be in plenty. Why is it that solar technology, after all these years, when we've understood the sun, we have it, we don't even need to look, it's there, we even have more than we need. How is it that the technology around solar hasn't advanced to the point where it does the very things that fossil fuels are supposed to do and other energies are supposed to do? Why is it that the technology can't be invented? Again, the question is, who owns that technology? Who owns the narrative? Because the moment you bring in the discussion and you talk about carbon footprints, how it is measured, when you talk about reduction, what actually happens? From where I sit, it appears to me that the countries that are developed haven't really changed the way they do things. They talk about it. What a country that is heavily industrial does, it moves its operations to another country. Mm-hmm. They're doing exactly what they were doing before. They're just simply not doing it in their country. So that represents a reduction in that particular footprint. Mm. So in real terms, what has really changed? Nothing. But adversely, what has happened is that they've taken that carbon footprint elsewhere. So those people are now going to have problems that they didn't have before. Mm. Mm. Now, the real discussion is, if you ask me, how do we grow and develop and get to the stage where we are actually developed, yet putting into practice what you may refer to as the best practices possible? Mm. And will we be allowed to even have that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a good argument. It's a good topic to discuss because one, we are not just a sovereign country, but also a democratic one. And therefore, even our laws recognize that the power is vested in the people. And therefore, we need to invest as much information and knowledge in them to make sure that they can make these decisions on what really is the best way forward. And the downside to that is that most of these agreements, one, they're not public. So people don't even know what we've signed. I mean, there are rumors that the Standard Gauge Railway, for instance, is a contract that when it was signed, we gave the port, Mombasa Port, as a collateral to it. And therefore, this doesn't necessarily show that we're making decisions that are in the best interest of the public. And therefore, for me, the conversation should be that we shouldn't stop anyone from having the conversation. I mean, me as a person, as a citizen of this country, and as a citizen of the world, it's something that I want to discuss, and it's something that I really want as many people as possible to know and understand about it, because it's not just about revenue, it's about people's lives, it's about people's livelihoods that we're putting into the balance here, and they need to be invested and capacitated into a point where they can make these decisions. And it's the reason why when we engaged people on the Lamu coal plant case, for instance, majority of the people in Lamu and including in Kenya have said no to the project, and it's the reason why we won in court by getting the environmental impact assessment license to be cancelled because of the many problems that it had. I agree that the case is still pending appeal, but at least we won on the initial courts. And therefore, for me, it should be a topic that everyone should be capacitated to speak about really significantly, and it shouldn't be about, like the example you've made, where countries and companies are moving away into other third world countries where it's cheap labor and doing some of these industrialization processes and taking the goods to them.
Yes.
It's the same thing that we're calling greenwashing campaigns, where these people look at a few renewable energy projects to do them, maybe a few hundred megawatts of electricity around renewables, and then all of a sudden they're saying we're now renewable, we're now pushing, but more than 90% of the investments is going into fossil fuel. So they're trying to make us lose the focus and start to dealing with symptoms, small headaches, when actually we're having a cancer.
Which
here.
is my problem with campaigns such as yours. I'm going to tell you directly. My problem with campaigns such as yours is that instead of focusing on such conversations, instead of focusing on the conversation that, all right, so Kenya with its very few megawatts, 1,400 or so megawatts of fuel, 92% of it is green. So we are green, but we need to industrialize. And then looking at those countries that are big emitters, that are still playing games with the fossil fuels and telling us you're going green, but we shall be 40% green in another 30 years, but we shall still be fossil heavy for the next 40, 50 years. Instead of focusing on those ones, you're focusing on Uganda and telling Uganda, stop extracting your oil that can give you revenues, and so don't develop. That conversation will move from Uganda. It'll come into Kenya with Turkana. Whatever the deal is, stop exploring that potential. Secondly, focus on who owns this technology of what you're promoting. Like City is saying, if we are talking about wind and solar, who owns the technology? For Kenya to get to that point of technology, we have to buy the technology for solar, for wind. For us to be able to develop our own technology, we need to be at a certain level of industrialization. We shall not get there unless we use the available energy sources that we have today. Why is the focus not on how can we get that technology either cheaper or free?
Yeah, and it's a fair comment, to be honest, what you're saying. So maybe I should have started by saying we're not just saying stop only the EACOP. We are also working with many other campaigns. We've worked with campaigns like the Stop Cambo campaign that's trying to stop oil explorations in the UK. We've worked with different other campaigns in the global south and also in the global north, trying to stop different projects. And therefore, it's not just that we are zeroing in on EACOP or on Kenyan issues only at this particular juncture. But I agree with you, because of the inequality that we've had from before, where the other countries have taken advantage of fossil fuels and gotten them to where they are today, then it means there is a debt on their part that they need to support the developing countries to make sure that they can also develop by the best way possible. And by the best way possible here, it doesn't necessarily mean it's fossil fuels. It could be renewables. And for this to happen, and I mean, if you've been reading some of the national determined contributions we've been making, Kenya has increasingly saying by 2032, we want to cut all our carbon emissions by, I think, around 30 or 32%. And they're saying that to be able to get there, they are committing resources themselves as a country, but they also want the global north. And I'm sure you've heard about the $100 billion kitty, where the United Nations want to keep aside to support developing worlds because of what they're calling climate reparations, not climate financing, because financing here connotes that someone is giving you money and you have to pay back. But it's reparations because they've benefited at the back of all our impoverishment and all of the impacts that we've seen. And therefore, it's to the best of everyone else that they pay back because of what they've benefited. So that also us, we can leapfrog all these dirty fossil fuels into a way that makes sense. I'm not saying that we should not industrialize as a continent. I'm only saying that we look at the best way to industrialize. And my case here is that fossil fuels is not that way.
Who benefits from having this conversation on the African continent in one way or another? Kind of like, we are asking you to do this. I mean, look at all the big world climate conversations that we've had over the last 12 months. What took place in Scotland, COP21, what took place thereafter, climate conference that took place in June last year, another one that's taking place this year. And it is focusing on developing countries and asking them to make sure that they reduce their imprint, right? Or reduce their footprint, rather. What do you think needs to be the responsibility of governments today? To say that what we are doing is focusing on state sovereignty and making sure that we actually are making a step forward in terms of development? Or is there a way that these two things can work hand in hand?
It's definitely a fair question. And it's true that we've had a lot of conference of parties around climate change issues. I think now we're getting to the 27th one at the end of this year in Egypt, which is, people are saying it's going to be the African COP. So hopefully it's a COP about Africa, not just in Africa, where, it's same deals and same things that are happening. But in terms of why we are in this conundrum right now, in terms of why we are not making headway on climate action, so to speak, I would say it's mostly because, and I know I'm making the companies look really bad at this point, but if you look at the people who attend these conference of parties, the lobbyists that they take there, like majority of the people who are there are actually lobbyists that are representing these companies. And therefore, it's one of the reasons why for all the conference of parties, including the Paris Agreement, you're not seeing any fossil fuels being mentioned there. You're not seeing any oil. You're just seeing about climate action and all these things that people are mentioning. And therefore, that's the problem that you're in, because the bargaining power is not the same. These people invest money, resources, and all their time to this. They do marketing, advertisement, and all other issues. And therefore, it's one of the reasons why people are still buying the issue. But I agree with you. At the end of the day, we have voted in people who should be responsible and should act less like leaders and more like representatives. And by being representatives, it means making decisions that supports and take care of us, so that we see less and less of droughts in Africa. All these natural disasters, it's not because God hates us, it's because of our own human actions that we've been doing. And therefore, the more we stop blaming God and coming back to our own real reasons why we've caused them, it's the only way that we can get past this problem that we are in today. And therefore, it has to be Kenya as a country, Africa as a continent, to sit down and think what really makes the best sense for Africa, and not just think about what the corporates and what the other countries bring into the continent, but what they themselves really want to see, so that the continent can move forward. Because the more we continue utilizing the same methods we've been using before, it's the reason why we'll keep stagnated into being third world countries and developing countries for the next foreseeable future.
Omar, as we conclude the conversation today, and we thank you very much for coming. So you're saying stop EACOP, stop the East African crude oil pipeline from Uganda to Tanzania. Then what? Are you saying Uganda should stop extracting oil?
So we are saying Uganda should stop EACOP because, one, it's not a resource that is benefiting them. Not that even if they were to do it within the country, but it makes it even worse because it doesn't benefit them. It's a resource that's going to be taken elsewhere. The same colonialist models we used to have before. But secondly, because there are many, many alternatives that they can utilize. Uganda has the capacity to exploit its food production sector to feed more than 200 million people. That's more than 4 Ugandans, and therefore they could export some of these resources. Tourism employs about 600,000 people within the country. If they invested in this resource, that would be good. I mean, the pipeline passes through across important tourism attraction sites, and an oil pipeline has never been a tourist attraction site. And therefore, it becomes important that they look at that sector. Okay. And also, finally, the opportunities that might be lost in other livelihoods like fisheries and others is also important. And therefore, they should not not be concerned about one small gain and make 10 losses going back.
Omar Elmawi, coordinator of the Stop EACOP campaign. Thank you very much for joining us today.